Good morning, students. So today we are going to discuss the third part of reproduction in flowering plants. In this mechanism, we are studying about that how the flowering plants produce their gametes and how these gametes fuse with each other. In the last two videos, we have seen the male gametophyte, that means how the male gamete is formed. As also we have seen that what is this male organ looks like. We have also seen that what is the female organ of a flowering plant and how does it produces the female gametophyte. And we had a small overview regarding the transfer of these gametophytes, that is the pollen grains, from one flower to the another one. In this video session we'll try to move deep into it so as to understand it very well. I'm your teacher Ankesh Singh. You can reach me at these two places, whichever is feasible to you for clearing your doubts. So let us move ahead and start our today's class. First thing is pollination. So we are discussing about the transfer of the gametophytes or the male gametophyte towards the female gametophyte, and this transfer is predefined in the pre-fertilization event. In that pre-fertilization event, we have an event known as gamete transfer. So we are basically discussing about this gamete transfer. Here the gamete transfer is named as pollination. What is the definition of it? The transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma of a flower is called pollination. Now pollen grains are generally immobile. They cannot reach the stigma by themselves. Hence they need an external agent for doing this. This external agent can be either wind, water, animal, gravity or growth contact. This pollination are of two different types, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. You can see in this diagram, in this chart, that pollination can be divided into self-pollination and cross-pollination, whereas self-pollination is again divided into autogamy and geitonogamy. Autogamy means pollination inside the same flower, and geitonogamy means different flower but of the same plant. That means genetically this transfer or this pollination is similar to that of autogamy. And what is cross-pollination or xenogamy? It involves two different factors. One is the abiotic factor, one is the biotic factors. Abiotic factors involves wind and water. The wind pollination is known as anemophily, and in case of water pollination it is known as hydrophily. The biotic factors are many, some of them are given here. We'll discuss about each of these process very deeply so that we can understand each and everything. Next, the first thing first, the self-pollination. It is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same or genetically similar flower. So you have to keep in mind that it is the transfer of what? The pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or the genetically similar flower. Accordingly, this self-pollination can be divided into two types, that is autogamy and geitonogamy. You can see in this diagram, if you see this diagram, we have the anthers here which produces the pollen grains, and these anthers are released and it goes and sits on the stigma of the same flower which contains the ovules inside it, right? So this process where the anthers are getting released and the pollen grains are getting released from the anther and it is falling on the stigma of the same flower, this kind of pollination is known as self-pollination. Next, let us see autogamy. So we have discussed in the previous diagram only that it is of two different types. What are they? Autogamy and geitonogamy. So we are first discussing about this autogamy. So what is this autogamy? It is the type of pollination in which intersexual flower or a perfect flower. What do you mean by the term perfect flower? The flower which contains all the parts, all the holes, example calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. So these kind of flowers, when are pollinated by their own pollen grains, such kind of pollination is known as what? Autogamy. Autogamy are of two different types. Either it can be homogamy or it can be clistogamy. What is autogamy? What is homogamy? Homogamy is a type of autogamy where the anther and the stigmas of the chasmogamous flowers or an open flower are brought together by growth, bending and folding. First of all, what is a chasmogamous flower? I have said it before also that what is a chasmogamous flower? Whose this anther and stigma is exposed, right? So we can also call it as an open flower. So in case of these open flowers, what they do, they bend their structures, they grow their structures, they fold their structures in such a pattern such that the stigma and the anther comes in close proximity, and the transfer of the pollen grains is much more easier in that case. And what are clastogamous flowers? Clistogamous flowers are such kind of flowers which are closed flowers. in which these androecium and gynoecium are closed inside a flower. In such kind of flower, the anther descends their pollen grains and the pollen grains directly falls on the stigma. Now in case of Cleistogamous flowers, the pollination is assured. There is no chance of pollen grain loss or anything of that sort. The pollen grains released and the pollen grains are getting attached to the stigma itself of the same flower. Hence the pollination is assured and it doesn't require any kind of pollinators. Next, we have to see about geitonogamy. So what is geitonogamy? It is the type of pollination in which the pollen grains of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower belonging to either of the same plant or genetically same plant. So what is geitonogamy? What was autogamy? Autogamy means transfer of the pollen grain from anther to stigma of the same flower. And what is geitonogamy? Geitonogamy means the transfer of the pollen grain from one flower to the stigma of the another flower of the same plant. So genetically this process is similar to that of autogamy, right? In this case, it shows certain kind of modification since it needs the transfer of the pollen grains from one flower to another flower. Hence, it shows certain kind of modifications, and these modifications are same or similar in case what we will found in case of xenogamy or cross-pollination. So you can see this diagram. This process is known as self-pollination and the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the same plant is known as geitonogamous pollination or geitonogamy in simple words. What are the advantages of the self-pollination? First of all, it maintains the parental characters or purity of the race indefinitely. Since it is not falling on any other new plant, hence the new character formation or new character development is not seen here. Hence the parental characters, what the characters their parent had, that same characters are found in the generations. Self pollination maintains a pure line. It maintains a very pure line, and this pure line is very much important in case of botanists because they perform several kind of hybridization experiments, and all these experiments requires pure line, and this pure line can be found by the process of self pollination. Third, the plant does not produce large amount of pollen grains since the transfer is very small. The transfer is nearly to the same proximity. Hence, it doesn't produce huge amount of pollen grains. Small amount of pollen grain production is enough for the pollination to occur. And the fourth thing is what? Flowers do not develop devices which attract pollinators. To attract pollinators, for attracting, why do we need to attract pollinators? In order to do cross pollination, we need to attract the pollinators so as to transfer the pollen grains with the help of them. Here the transfer is very simple and the transfer is very easy, and hence it doesn't need any kind of pollinators, and thus the flowers generally doesn't develop any kind of characters which can attract the pollinators. But there are certain cases where it develops the floral rewards or these developing characters or developing devices which can attract the pollinators to help them to ensure that 100% pollination is possible. Just like the advantages, there are certain disadvantages. What are the disadvantages? First of all, as I have said, no new characters are formed. Sorry for that. No new characters are formed. Second, vigority and the vitality of the race is decreased as we do huge amount of self-pollination. Generally, the vitality of the plant gets reduced. Immunity gets decreased and adaptability to adapt in the changed environment is decreased. So there are certain disadvantages of this self-pollination process also. Next, we have to see about the cross-pollination. We'll discuss about this cross-pollination in a broader way in the upcoming classes, but let us have a small overview regarding it. So what is cross-pollination? That is the transfer of the pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of a genetically different flower. So geitonogamy, what was autogamy? Let us revise it once more. So what was autogamy? Autogamy is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to stigma of the same flower, right, or genetically similar flower. Second, what was geitonogamy? The transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma of different flower but of the same plant, right? And finally, what is cross pollination? That cross pollination means the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma of two different flowers of a different plant or a genetically different flower. Now this cross pollination is performed with the help of several external agencies. It takes the help of pollinators. You can see in this diagram the pollen grains are developed. These pollen grains from the stamens sticks on a legs of the bee. Now these pollen grains are being carried away by the bee to the different plant, where they release these pollen grains on the stigma while taking nectar from them. So one thing you have to keep in mind that during to help this cross pollination process, the flowers develops floral rewards. That means it develops certain kind of devices which can attract the insects or any kind of pollinators towards them to help this process to occur. In the next diagram, you can see this pollination are of two different types. We have discussed about this self-pollination, and in this cross-pollination, we have abiotic agents, what I have said in the beginning of this lecture. It can be either made by the wind, known as anemophily, or by water, known as hydrophily, or it can undergo with the help of certain biotic agents, that means living agents, which can be many. Here you cannot see the name of the humans, but humans also help in the process of this phylly or this cross pollination. So here you have some examples, like by beetle it is carnathophily, for moths it is phalaenophily, for bees it is melophily. So for each one of them we have a different name. But in the next video session what we are going to see that what are the modifications being done by the flower in order to help this wind pollination, also known as anemophily. What are the things that are being formed by flowers in order to help this hydrophily, and what are the things or what are the floral rewards which is being given by the flower in order to perform cross pollination with the help of these biotic agents, which can be any one of these. Clear? So in the next video we are going to see about detailed cross pollination. In this video we have studied about self pollination. First of all, we saw the definition of pollination, then the types of pollination, then we have seen autogamy, and after that we have seen what are the different types of autogamy. We have seen geitonogamy, what is the basic thing, and then we have seen that what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the process of self pollination. So this is the summary of this total lecture. We have studied about pollination, self pollination, autogamy, furthermore geitonogamy, advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination, and last but not the least, cross-pollination and their types, which was a just small overview. In the next video session, we'll see a detailed overview of this cross-pollination process. Until then, thank you for listening to this video session. Hope you all understood what I have taught you today. If you have any questions, any doubts, you can reach me at these two places, whichever is feasible for you. Until the next time, see you and have a nice day ahead and stay safe.